These promises strong as a spell. I'll never tell. Yeah, I like you.
Hi guys, welcome back to exmolex. I recently did this video where I talked about the tragic story of one of my Mormon pioneer ancestors. Now, even though that story was really sad, I actually really enjoyed doing the research for that story and putting that video together. Family history is one of my special interests, so obviously doing a video that was centered around that was extra interesting for me. But a lot of my viewers seem to really enjoy it too, so I decided to put together another video like that one. I'm probably going to make this a regular series on my channel and put together a playlist because I enjoy making these types of videos. So if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment. If you didn't catch the previous video or the pioneer video I did over this past summer, check the links in the description so you can watch those ones too. For this video, I looked at some of the Mormon pioneers on both my side and my husband's side of the family to find these stories. I know that a lot of my viewers don't actually watch my YouTube videos, they just listen to them, which is totally fine. I do that on YouTube a lot as well. But I did want to let you know that whenever I can find pictures of the people in these stories, I'm going to put them on the screen. As with the other videos in this series, I feel like as an ex-Mormon, we are given this very whitewashed version of the Mormon pioneers. The things we hear about Mormon pioneers when we grow up in the church are inspirational stories of faith. Sometimes sad things happen in these stories, but they always turn it around to make it seem like anything these people went through was worth it because they were following God's commandments and they will be blessed with this beautiful afterlife. When and if polygamy is ever talked about, usually you're hearing stories about sister wives who just love each other and got along so well and everything was just perfect and everybody was so happy, when in reality, a lot of times it was a huge struggle for women in the church. A lot of polygamous marriages, the women did not get along, or the men had like a favorite wife and so she was treated better than the other wives. Sometimes one of his wives lives with him in like a nice home and his other wives are delegated into these like little shacks that they live in. A lot of people who crossed the plains either got very sick themselves, lost children, lost parents, lost siblings to things like cholera. When the Mormon pioneers actually made it to Utah, many of them were extremely poor. They didn't have money or supplies to make shoes, so they went barefoot in the snow. And the men, who oftentimes had several wives and sometimes dozens of children, obviously didn't have the means to provide for all of those people. So it was hard times and they suffered a lot. We don't typically hear about that. When we do, again, it's obviously very whitewashed and it's framed in a way that like all that suffering is totally going to be worth it in the end, and you know, even though that person lost everyone near and dear to their hearts, they just had a lot of faith. So I hope by sharing these stories from another point of view, more people can understand that it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. There were people who joined the church and regretted it. There were people who trekked across the plains and died the day they got there. There were women who entered into polygamous marriages and were miserable. The first story I want to share is just a little blurb from one of the pioneer stories I read through that was so sad I had to share it with you guys. Grandfather's sisters, Jemima and Annie, came to Utah with the first of the family. His sister Elizabeth followed soon after, crossing the plains in the ill-fated Martin's Handcart Company, where so many died of exposure. It is said that their trail could have been traced by the tracks of their bleeding feet in the snow. The thing that makes me so sad hearing about things like that is that, like, obviously a lot of these people were adults who chose to join the church and chose to trek over to Zion, but these people a lot of times had like 10 kids. And none of those kids had the choice. And as somebody who has little kids, it makes me feel so sad to think of them having to go through that, especially because one of my kids in particular really does not like hiking. I love hiking and my other kids love hiking, so I take them on hikes, but this one kid, not a fan. They will go like a mile maybe and then be like, carry me. But these people were walking like 10 to 15 miles per day with little kids, and most of the time the kids weren't riding in the wagons, they were actually walking. This was said about one of my ancestors named Mary, who died in her 60s while traveling from England to Utah as a pioneer. This other great-grandmother of mine died alone among strangers in a barren desert. What a trail of graves marked the way to Zion. Again, just so sad. Like I've said in this video and previous videos, for some people it was worth it. They made their way to Zion, they started a life there, and things went well. But there's other stories that I've read where people got there and they were just as poor and destitute as they were before they left, but now they don't have any relatives. Now they don't have any support or family. In many places, the road had to be made, and in the mountains, many difficulties arose. 5 of the guard children had birthdays during the journey. The story has come down through the family that on the 1,000-mile trek, if they got a splinter or thorn in their foot, they would get to ride behind their father's saddle or on a wagon, a rare treat. In this family, there were 8 children that made this trek from ages 4 to 20 years old. And like I said, getting to ride in a wagon or on a horse wasn't something that they got to do very often. It's only if they got like a thorn in their foot or something. Sophronia had a very jealous nature, so having to share a husband with 3 other wives, she was very unhappy and lonesome. She finally secured a separation and married a different man. She was still unhappy in this new relationship and left him too. She ended up going back to her first husband and apologized for being so foolish. But he was a stubborn man and would not forgive her. She was heartbroken. She had many hardships in her life and became rather discouraged with life and was ready for death. This is obviously conjecture because we don't know the whole story. This is all we have. But just based on my thoughts of being a woman, she wasn't happy being with her husband, who had 3 other wives. She was jealous. It wasn't a good situation for her. I would be the same way. I'm not much into sharing. So she leaves her husband because she's unhappy, gets into a new relationship, is still unhappy in that relationship. I wonder if when she chose to go back and try to beg forgiveness from her first husband, if really she was destitute, didn't have anybody to take care of her, and felt like she didn't have another choice. And then this guy is like, no, no, I don't forgive you, get away from me. And she just dies alone and sad. Ruth and her children used to hide in the woods to avoid the mobs. When it rained, they used a blanket as a tent. One night, the mob came to the house when all the men were away. The mob ordered all the occupants out so they could burn their home. Everyone left except Ruth, who was very ill in bed. They told the mob the situation, and they left only to return a second and a third time and set fire to the house. The women ran into the fire, wrapped Ruth in a blanket, and carried her out of the burning home and put her in their wagon to make their escape. She was very ill when they crossed the Mississippi River and journeyed on to Council Bluffs. Ruth and her family were preparing to cross the plains with the pioneers in 1848. Before they started, Ruth died on May 6, 1848, at the age of 58. This is very interesting to me. So the mobs they're talking about, in Missouri, there was an execution order for Mormons. And a lot of the times, the way Mormons tell it, it's like the Mormons were persecuted for their faith. And that's like pretty much all they'll say. They won't really get into the specific details. They just make it sound like people didn't like Mormons because Mormons have the pure, true gospel and the people were filled with the hatred of Satan, so they just didn't like Mormons. And that's why mobs were coming after them. But the reality is a lot more complicated than that. There were a lot of politics that went into it. There was a lot of stuff Joseph Smith in particular was doing that went into it. I can make a whole video about that if you guys are interested in like kind of getting a broader perspective on all of that. But that's the mobs they're talking about. The thing I think is really interesting about this story is in particular this bit, which like it's not funny because it's really terrible and violent. Like all the stuff that was going on was really sad, but the way the story is told, the mob comes to their house and is like, everybody get out, we're gonna burn the building down. Which first of all, like the fact that they even warned them, I'm like, well, that's interesting. And then they tell them the situation like, oh, we all left except for Mama Ruth, who is so ill she can't stand up, so she can't leave the house. And then the mob's like, oh, okay, so they leave. The angry mob leaves, and then they came back, and then they left again, and then they came back and were like, well, yeah, she's sick in bed, but we're gonna burn the house down anyway. And then the family goes in and saves her. I am just very interested. Like, I want to know more details about that. Because the way it's told, it sounds very cartoony. You know what I mean? Like, it sounds like an episode of maybe like South Park or something, where they all show up, like this angry mob shows up and is like, everybody get out, we're gonna burn this house down. And they're like, oh, sorry, Ruth can't come out right now, she's sick. And they're like, oh, okay. So they leave. It's weird. It's a weird story. I want to know more specifics. Here I want to share some stories from a family member named Mary Ann. She crossed the plains when she was only 9 years old. We had only traveled a short ways when my little sister, Louise, 5 years old, took very sick, and after 3 days of sickness died and was buried at Council Bluffs. This was a terrible blow to my dear mother. She had just left her home and relatives behind, and now they laid their little golden-haired darling to rest, never to visit the spot again. That hit me especially hard as a mom of a 5-year-old golden-haired darling. I just simply cannot imagine. She says it was a terrible blow to her mother. I would never recover. I would never recover from that. Obviously, in this time period, it was more common for people not to live to adulthood. And I got that comment on the last video I made, just talking about Melissa, who so many of her close loved ones passed away. And it was obviously more common. It happened. A lot of people didn't make it into adulthood because they didn't have the resources and the health care that we have now. But there were a lot of unnecessary deaths for the pioneers who made their way to Utah. And again, the saddest part to me is the children who did not have the choice. Their parents joined the church and made the choice to go to Utah, and their kids just had to go with them. You talk of hard times. We came here at the time the crickets and grasshoppers were on here and ate everything up. We lived on bran bread, and many mornings we had to walk 1.5 miles to dig sago and thistle roots with sharp sticks to live on. My parents had only been in Salt Lake City a short time when the greatest of all calamities befell them. Mother was stricken ill with mountain fever, and on August 28, 1849, she passed away to the great beyond. When Father saw that Mother had passed away, he threw himself across the bed and said that if it wasn't for his children, he would pray to die. However, he too was stricken down with the same disease, and on September 5th, 1849 at 2 p.m., he joined his dear wife and left 7 motherless children to the mercy of the people. But there weren't 7 of them for long. The oldest son, William, was at death's door and died the next day. He was buried in the same grave as his father, Wilson. My brother James took down with the same disease, and before 2 months were ended, he too had passed away. It looked as if the whole family was to pass to the other side. My mother, father, and 2 brothers were buried without being placed in a casket or coffin. Old wagon boxes were all we could afford. They were cut to make a final resting place for them. This left 3 boys and 2 girls, and we had not one bite in the house to eat. The last food we had was a peck of corn which father had paid $5 for. Neighbors and kind friends came to the rescue and took us into their own homes, separating all of us. It was a sad parting, for our arrival in 1848 in the valley had hoped to be a happy one. Tragedy interfered. It was about 6 months later that more wagons arrived and brought grandfather and grandmother and several other families. Grandfather gathered up the children and we lived with them. He did his best by us all. I feel like if you were to hear this story from a Mormon perspective or in a Mormon meeting, you would hear about how Mary Ann had so much faith. She went through all these trials and she stayed a member of the church and, you know, she made it to Zion. So isn't that wonderful? And I just can't help but think maybe she wouldn't have had to go through all of this terrible suffering if her family hadn't decided to go to Utah. Maybe her parents and her little sister and her brothers would have survived. Would they have had to go through all this suffering? Like, obviously there's not a way to know for sure, but the sicknesses that were breaking out among the people were really terrible during that time. There were so many people who died, and I've seen this on both sides of my family and my husband's family, where there's just like tragedy after tragedy, people getting sick, people being run over by wagons. That was something that happened to Mary Ann. She fell off of a wagon and was run over by the front and back wheels while they were making their way to Utah. And thankfully, somehow she was okay and she didn't die. But sometimes people weren't so lucky and they did die from things like that happening to them. It just all feels like such unnecessary suffering. And what I talked about in the last video was like, how much is too much to ask in terms of sacrifice for your religion? I don't know. Personally, I feel like even losing 1 child would be way too much for me. This is a really interesting one from my husband's side of the family that I was like, I have to share this with you guys. One time, when Josiah was having a quick one for the road, a large, powerful man who was drinking at the bar became really loud and obnoxious, cursing Mormons as the scum of the earth, etc. Josiah tried to reason with the man by telling him surely there was some mistake because he had a brother who came west and joined the Mormon church and he was a good man. The loudmouth man was beyond all reason and said that Josiah was a no-good so-and-so for sticking up for the Mormons, whereupon Josiah proceeded to beat the man nearly to death. In fact, Josiah thought he had killed him, so he ran out of the saloon to where his team stood waiting at a hitching post with his loaded wagon. He cut loose his lead horse and fled to New Mexico, where he finally learned that the man was not dead and he could safely return to his family. I'm sorry, what? Like, the whole story is wild, but what's even more wild to me is the man in the story, Josiah, he wasn't a Mormon. His brother just happened to be one. And so he thought, this guy doesn't like Mormons. I'll teach him a lesson. And almost kills him, almost beats him to death. And I just think to myself, like, yeah, you showed that guy. Mormons are actually great people. Like, it's bizarre. What? This is the last one I'm going to share today, the story of Anne and Ezra. While they were on their way to Utah, Ezra married his second wife, Lois. They had 3 children together. Ezra's first wife passed away. The practice of widows becoming plural wives of established men became common, and Ezra took a third wife, a widow named Anne. In 1853, Anne was a 33-year-old widow with 3 small sons. Apparently, there was no romance involved, but on April 3rd, 1853, she became the third wife of Ezra, age 56. 56 and 33. Less than a year later, Ezra married a 4th wife, Caroline. Caroline left Ezra soon after having their first child together. Some of these arranged marriages were successful, but with Ezra and Anne, this was not the case. They had 3 children together, but Ezra favored his second wife, Lois. He never provided for Anne or her children. Anne's sons from her first marriage disliked and sometimes hated their stepfather. Anne was the full support for her family. Anne told her daughter-in-law, Mary, several different times about an incident in Salt Lake. Anne had saved enough money to buy a piece of material to make some badly needed clothes, and Ezra took it away and gave it to Lois. The next time Anne saw it, Lois had made it into a dress and was wearing it. In the early years of the church, it was not uncommon for a bishop to call his ward members to repentance. Ezra was called before a bishop's court on 2 occasions. On June 27, 1853, he was ordered to pay Charles White $3 in flour at 8 cents a pound for failures to fulfill a contract on an agreement. On May 10, 1856, for unchristian-like conduct in his family and for not paying his tithing. He promised to do better and was forgiven. Anne and her children felt like they were not treated fairly. On another occasion, Ezra took a window out of Anne's small shack to replace a broken window in his big home that he shared with Lois. Anne took various jobs. Her son, Mansell, said that his mother worked all day cleaning houses or taking in washing or whatever work she could get, usually for 50 cents a day. The children had to be left alone and would play in the street all day. Anne sewed and may have also earned money doing that. She also served as a midwife for both her family and others. Anne, who lived for a while in a Massachusetts poorhouse as a child, never in her life got far from that condition. Often, the only supper Anne could give her children was stale bread divided between them all. Anne left Ezra in 1861 and thereafter went by her first married name. She had been sealed to Ezra but said he didn't treat her right and she didn't want to be sealed to him. This story had a lot of similarities to the story I shared in the previous video about Melissa and her husband George. But it seems like oftentimes these men would take multiple wives and then favor one of them over the others. Melissa, from the previous video, her husband married her and then went on a mission and brought back 3 younger wives, married all of them, and Melissa was never happy after that. And in this story, Anne and Ezra get married in sort of an arranged marriage, but he never loves her, never provides for her, never treats her as well, and honestly treats her badly. In Melissa's story, she gets her bed taken away from her by George. And in Anne's story, she gets the fabric that she saved up to buy taken away from her, and she gets a window pane taken off of her little shack that she lives in so that he can put it in a window for his other wife. You don't hear these kinds of stories when you're growing up in the Mormon church. The pioneer stories, sometimes they are sad, but they're always framed in a faith-promoting way. Personally, I see nothing faith-promoting about these kinds of stories. They're just plain sad. And it makes me wonder what their lives were really like, because we don't have a lot to go on. You sometimes have some pictures or a letter or a journal entry, but people's lives are so long and our emotions are so complex and our relationships are complex and the things we go through are so much more than can be documented in like 1 or 2 journal entries. What I would really love is to be able to get my hands on a Mormon pioneer journal where whoever it is goes really in depth into like their feelings on what they're going through, especially, you know, if it was a little bit different than what we usually hear in church about, like, I just know the church is true, and even though I'm going through all these really difficult, terrible things, I just know the church is true, and I have so much faith, and Heavenly Father's gonna bless me in the afterlife, and hopefully I'll make it to the celestial kingdom because my mother and my father and my brother and my son all died. Like, as sad as it is, I want the more specific details of it. I want to hear how you suffered. I want to hear what you were going through. I want to hear your complex thoughts on it. I want to hear if they, you know, questioned the church at any point. So if you have any of those stories you'd like to share, please either leave them in the comments or send me an email to exmolex@gmail.com and let me know if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Huge thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel. You guys are the best. And extra special thank you to Amy and Doug Davis for supporting at the Demon tier on my Patreon. If you guys would like to support the channel, there are links to do so in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future videos, and I'll see you guys next next time. Bye.
Promises strong as a spell. I'll never tell. Yeah, I like you, that's for sure.